The courtroom was charged with tension, the kind of stillness that makes every breath feel like it could shatter the air. The sound of shuffling papers, the soft clicks of pens, the faint hum of the air conditioning. Nothing was allowed to break the silence. Above it all, the towering presence of the judges loomed, their faces unreadable. At the front of the room, a battle was unfolding. On one side, Jasmine Crockett, a young congresswoman standing her ground with quiet grace. On the other, the towering figure of John Roberts, his icy composure a silent challenge to everything she stood for. Crockett adjusted the microphone, her hands steady, though her pulse raced beneath the surface. She knew this moment could define her career. The words she would speak, the truth she would lay bare, this was more than a debate. This was a fight for dignity, a fight to be heard. With a calm that belied the tension swirling around her, she began, "To the teachers, the ones who stand in front of our children every day, no matter the challenges they face, who buy their own supplies, who spend their own money, their own time, just to ensure that the future of our country has the tools to succeed." There was a pause. No applause, no cheers, but heads turned. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some people, including the press, sat up straighter, taking note of her words. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for an entire community. And then came the sound, the unexpected jarring sound of one clap. It rang out sharply across the chamber. A single person stood, Kash Patel. His eyes locked on Crockett's, his hands coming together slowly, deliberately. The room froze. The cameras snapped to attention. As if on cue, others began to follow. Reluctantly at first, but then, the rhythm of clapping began to swell, echoing louder with each passing second. Jasmine Crockett paused mid-sentence. Her breath caught. She looked up, confusion flashing across her face for just a moment before her expression steadied. The room was divided. Some clapped, others stayed frozen, staring ahead, unmoved. The tension thickened, but as the silence returned, there was no denying the shift. Narrator's voiceover. What happened next stunned the courtroom. A single line that would forever change the dynamics of the case. But as the silence hung heavy, Roberts's eyes locked on hers. And that look spoke volumes. The air in the courtroom was thick, charged with an undercurrent of tension that no one could deny. Every inch of the room felt steeped in history, the kind of history that had already been written before this trial began. And yet, in that very moment, the weight of what was to come felt heavier than it had ever been. The case had become more than a mere legal battle. It was a battle of ideologies, a reflection of the partisan divides that had torn through America's political landscape. The courtroom itself, a symbol of authority and impartiality, now felt like a battleground. The Supreme Court had become a stage for a much larger war, and every word spoken here, every decision made, would echo through the nation for generations to come. Jasmine Crockett, standing at the heart of this tempest, had entered the room with a singular mission: to make a difference. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a voice for those who had been ignored, a force rising from the underrepresented corners of America. Her roots ran deep. Her family's struggle with injustice and inequality had shaped her every step. But the path she walked was not easy. As a progressive leader in a time of deep partisan fracture, Crockett had long been fighting an uphill battle. Her presence in the courtroom was not just about winning this case. It was about shifting the tides of an entire political landscape that had been hostile to her and those she represented. With every step she took, she faced skepticism from both sides. To some, she was the future of progressivism. To others, she was an unwelcome disruptor, a threat to the establishment. The eyes of the nation were on her. The questions swirling around her head as she stepped up to the mic weren't just about the case at hand, but about what kind of country America wanted to be. It was about whether justice was truly for all, or whether it was just another game for the powerful to control. She could feel it, the weight of this decision on her shoulders. Across the room, the judges sat with impassive faces, their eyes scanning the room, calculating every moment. They were seasoned, professional, but they weren't immune to the stakes. In the back, the lawyers for both sides whispered behind closed doors, their arguments rehearsed and ready for battle. But the real tension was in the air, a palpable electricity that no one could ignore. Behind the legal proceedings, there was a greater force at work. This wasn't just a case about policy or precedent. It was a fight over identity. Who got to define the rules of America? Who controlled the future? Jasmine Crockett, in that moment, became a symbol of a new generation rising against the status quo, of a community that had long been silenced, now finding its voice in the most powerful room in the land. But John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, sat on the other side of the aisle, a seasoned, conservative figure with a reputation for unwavering decision-making. His demeanor was calm yet unyielding. He had seen countless cases come and go, but this one felt different. Roberts had his own set of beliefs, his own approach to law, and Crockett's rising influence was an unknown variable in his established world. The divide between them was clear. She represented the hope of the new America, diverse, empathetic, bold. He represented the established guard, the tradition, and the careful precision of the law as it had always been interpreted. Crockett's rise was a disruption in a system that had been built on predictability, and Roberts was a figure who embodied that system. The courtroom was a microcosm of the country itself, a land at war with its identity. There was no mistaking it. The stakes of the case went far beyond any legal argument. This was about the future of America itself. The moment was now. Every gaze in the room, whether it was from the judges, the lawyers, or the media, was fixed on Jasmine. The weight of history was pressing down on her, yet her resolve remained unshaken. "What happens next?" whispered the voice of the narrator. "Will change the course of history." As she stood in the shadow of John Roberts, surrounded by the most powerful figures in the nation, Jasmine Crockett knew this was her moment to shine. The courtroom was no longer just a place where laws were argued. It had become the crucible in which America's soul would be tested. John Roberts had seen it all. The courtrooms, the high-stakes cases, the fiery debates. He had watched the nation transform under the weight of the law and power. And through it all, he had stood firm, a quiet giant on the judicial throne. As the Chief Justice of the United States, he commanded authority, and his words carried the weight of decades of legal tradition. But there was something colder about Roberts than the typical figurehead of the Supreme Court. His intellect was razor-sharp, his knowledge of the law encyclopedic, and his demeanor. There was no room for sentiment in his world, no room for doubt. What mattered in his eyes was order, consistency, and precedent. The law, as he saw it, was a force of nature, a tool not for bending to ideals or ideologies, but for maintaining balance in a chaotic world. He was a man forged in the heat of conservative thought, raised on the belief that the Constitution wasn't just a document, but the sacred foundation of the nation. His decisions were measured, deliberate, and often unwavering. To the people who admired him, he was the epitome of judicial integrity, the protector of tradition. To his critics, he was the embodiment of an establishment that refused to evolve, an anchor that held the country back from the progress it so desperately needed. Roberts' career had been built on conservatism. His opinions, especially in cases concerning civil rights, voting laws, and social policies, reflected a man who firmly believed in the weight of history over the flexibility of change. He had always framed himself as the moderate among the conservatives, walking the fine line between respecting legal precedent and preserving the balance of power in the country. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a protector of order that, in his mind, had worked for generations. But the forces opposing him had grown louder. The world was changing, and with it, the laws and norms he had defended for so long were being scrutinized, challenged, and in some cases dismantled. The voices calling for reform, the young, the disenfranchised, the progressives, had only grown stronger. And yet Roberts, like a stone in a river, stood unmoved by the current of change. The courtroom was, for him, a battlefield. He had seen many fight on the side of progressivism, new ideas, bold arguments, and passionate pleas for justice. But he had never quite understood it. What was the rush? Why couldn't they wait, deliberate, and allow history to unfold on its own terms? The law, in his mind, wasn't something to be rushed or reinterpreted based on the whims of the moment. It was something to be respected and preserved, And yet, the political landscape of America was shifting, faster than Roberts could control. The calls for social change were impossible to ignore. In the heart of the courtroom, the political divide had never been so stark. To his left stood the progressives, including Jasmine Crockett, whose firebrand speeches and unapologetic advocacy for marginalized communities had made her a rising star in the political world. She was bold, unyielding, a challenge to everything Roberts believed in. She was the embodiment of the new America, one that he often viewed as reckless and misguided. But undeniably full of energy, Roberts had long been the embodiment of the old guard, a figure whose authority was unquestioned, a defender of the past. But Crockett, with her sharp, clear-eyed vision for the future, had already begun to chip away at the structures he had so carefully built. She was everything Roberts was not, loud, unfiltered, and driven by an idealism that saw the world not as it was, but as it should be. And the courtroom knew it. The lines were drawn. On one side, the establishment, Roberts, the stalwart defender of tradition. On the other, the revolutionaries, the people who saw Crockett as the face of the future, a voice for the unheard, a beacon for justice that could not be contained by the shackles of history. In that space, the tension was palpable. The world was shifting, and Roberts, despite his years of legal experience, found himself struggling to maintain control over the narrative. But there was something else, something deeper beneath his hardened exterior. Even Roberts, a man of such monumental strength, had been challenged. He had spent years walking the line between respect for tradition and the pressure for progress. But now, with Crockett's rise, his carefully constructed world was facing something he hadn't anticipated, a force so undeniable that it threatened to tip the scales of justice in ways he hadn't yet grasped. Beneath his stoic surface, Roberts felt it, the subtle recognition that what he had long believed was now up for debate. The forces of history were coming for him, and for the first time, he couldn't be certain whether the side of the past he had stood on would survive the storm. The clock was ticking, the progressive wave was gaining momentum, and Crockett was riding that tide like a tidal wave crashing against Roberts' fortress of control. He had spent his life ensuring that history remained on his side. But now, standing in front of him, was someone who embodied everything he feared, an unyielding voice for a new world. But beneath his polished exterior, Roberts was about to witness something that would challenge his very approach. He had weathered many storms in his career, but this one felt different. Crockett wasn't just fighting for a political victory. She was fighting for a vision of America that he could no longer ignore. And as the case unfolded, Roberts would have to reckon with a truth he had long evaded. No matter how firm the walls of the establishment, change was coming, and it was coming for him. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from privilege. She wasn't born with silver spoons in her mouth, nor was she surrounded by the powerful forces that shaped the very institutions she was now challenging. She came from nothing. Not in the sense that she lacked resources, but in the sense that she had to build everything from the ground up. From the dust of her humble beginnings, she had carved out a place for herself piece by piece. With relentless determination, born in a small, working-class neighborhood in Dallas, Texas, Crockett was shaped by the harsh realities of life that many in the room of the Supreme Court would never understand. Her family, black and middle class, had lived in a world where systemic barriers were woven into the very fabric of existence. From a young age, she had witnessed her mother, a high school teacher, struggle with the limitations placed on her career because of the color of her skin and her gender. Her father, a blue-collar worker with calloused hands and an even more calloused heart, had always dreamed of giving his children something better. But no matter how hard he worked, the doors to opportunity often slammed shut in his face. It wasn't because he wasn't capable or hard-working. It was because in America, some doors are built to remain closed for people like him. For people like Jasmine, Crockett's early experiences with discrimination had forged her resolve to seek justice, not just for herself, but for the marginalized. As a child, she had watched her mother endure ridicule in meetings with colleagues who questioned her qualifications and raised their eyebrows when she was promoted. It wasn't that Crockett's mother was the most talented teacher in the room. It was that she had to work harder than everyone else to prove she belonged. That was the world her mother had lived in, a world of unspoken biases that could cripple even the brightest souls if they didn't fight for every inch. But it wasn't just the world her mother lived in that left an impact. It was Crockett's own experiences with inequality that had crystallized her understanding of the world. As a young girl, she saw how the justice system turned a blind eye to the needs of those who were too often forgotten. Her own family had fallen victim to the ways the system discriminated against the poor and people of color. Minority communities in her neighborhood were often subjected to harsher sentences, less funding for schools, and fewer opportunities in the workplace. Every time she witnessed an injustice, it burned her a little deeper, until one day, she had no choice but to stand up and say enough. She didn't arrive at the courtroom by chance. Her path had been shaped by an unyielding belief that justice wasn't a privilege, it was a right. Crockett had earned her place in the courtroom, but not without significant sacrifices along the way. Her early years in law school were a blur of sleepless nights, intense study, and financial strain. But those struggles didn't break her. They honed her. They gave her an insight into the broken systems that had never served her community. And they fueled her ambition to become the kind of lawyer who could disrupt those systems. Her first days in the legal field were spent fighting battles that were already rigged against her. As a young black woman, Crockett found herself constantly battling stereotypes and proving her worth. White male colleagues doubted her intellect, superiors questioned her leadership abilities, and yet she persisted. Every instance of discrimination only deepened her resolve, not just to succeed, but to break down the walls that had been erected around people who looked like her. She fought for the disenfranchised, the unheard, and the ignored. She became a voice for the powerless, and through it all, the same fire that had burned within her since childhood continued to guide her. One evening, as Crockett sat at her desk, papers scattered, coffee cup forgotten, a long day's work still waiting, she found herself thinking of her mother. That quiet sacrifice had shaped everything she was. Her mother's struggle to be heard, her sacrifices made with no expectation of gratitude, her fight against a world that seemed determined to ignore her. These were the lessons that had always guided Crockett. Her mother had never been one for grand speeches or accolades. Instead, she lived her values every day. She believed in teaching with honor, in standing up for the vulnerable, and in fighting for what was just even when the world made it seem impossible. And that was exactly what Crockett did. Her entire life was an ode to that sacrifice. But this moment in the courtroom, this monumental case against Roberts and the forces that stood in his corner, was different. It wasn't just about fighting for the ideals her mother had instilled in her. It was about fighting for the future of the country her mother had worked so tirelessly to serve, and the future that Crockett's children and grandchildren would one day inherit. When she stepped into the courtroom that day, Crockett wasn't just there as a lawyer. She was there as the voice of a generation that had spent too long being ignored by the powers that be. She was there to represent the unrepresented, to stand up to John Roberts, the man who embodied everything the old America stood for. But she wasn't just fighting for today's ideals. She was fighting for the possibility of tomorrow. In that moment, Crockett realized that her background, her struggles, her family's sacrifices, they weren't just the foundation of her resolve. They were the source of her strength. And as she stood before Roberts, the man who represented a system that had kept people like her from the table for so long, Crockett knew that this wasn't just her moment. It was the moment that would change the future. She was ready. The tension in the courtroom grew palpable, thickening with every word spoken, every glance exchanged. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about control, about power, and about something even deeper. A battle of ideals, of what this country was meant to be and what it had become. Every second felt like a slow-moving storm. And inside that storm, Jasmine Crockett was standing firm, not just for herself, but for every voice that had ever been silenced by the establishment. Robert's piercing gaze never wavered as he locked eyes with her, his voice cool and measured. "What you're suggesting, Ms. Crockett, would open the door to chaos. We can't simply rewrite the rules because it feels right in the moment. This is the law, not a personal vendetta. Crockett, her face a mask of calm resolve, responded without hesitation. And yet, sir, the law is only as strong as its commitment to justice. When the law is wielded to protect the powerful while silencing the powerless, then we have a responsibility to rewrite it, to redefine it, not based on convenience but on what is right. The room held its breath. Crockett's words, though measured, were charged with passion, a fire that burned beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't just arguing legal points. She was challenging the very heart of the law itself. Her eyes locked with Roberts, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, unwavering in her belief that the law could and should be used for good. But Roberts was unyielding. What you call right is subjective, Ms. Crockett. The law cannot be defined by emotion. It must remain impartial, detached from the waves of popular sentiment. To do otherwise is to undermine its very foundation. Each word he spoke was sharp, calculated, as if he was trying to cut through her arguments with the precision of a scalpel. But for every word he said, Crockett stood taller, the confidence in her stance growing with each counterpoint. You talk about impartiality. Justice Roberts, Crockett responded, her voice steady yet intense. But what about when the law is used to enforce inequality? To support an unjust status quo? Is that impartiality? Is that fairness? Her words were met with an audible shift in the room. Some of the faces around her remained impassive, like statues carved from stone, unwilling to show any emotion. But others, the younger faces, the faces of those who had long felt unseen in the corridors of power, couldn't help but nod ever so slightly in agreement. The tension in the room wasn't just political now, it was personal. Every word felt like a tiny revolution, a small defiance against a system that had forgotten its purpose. Robert's expression tightened. His reputation for cold precision was being questioned in front of the nation, and that was something he couldn't allow. He leaned forward, his voice lowering, almost as if trying to strike fear into her, or perhaps into the courtroom itself. Ms. Crockett, you speak of fairness and justice as if they can be legislated through sheer will. You forget the weight of precedent. The law is built on centuries of tradition. To suggest that we abandon that for the sake of a fleeting moral righteousness is dangerous. Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. What's truly dangerous, Justice Roberts, is sitting back and allowing a broken system to perpetuate itself. You claim to protect the law, but what about the people the law fails every single day? If we are to have any hope for true justice, we have to be willing to challenge what's in place. We must be willing to change. The courtroom shifted again, this time with more noticeable discomfort. Some members of the audience glanced at each other, unease flickering across their faces. The debate was no longer confined to the cold, logical arguments of the courtroom. It had become something personal, something that felt like it could touch everyone in the room. The judges exchanged subtle glances, but their faces remained as neutral as ever. They were used to these debates, to the political firestorms that often came with the territory. But Crockett's words were different. There was a resolve in them that no one could easily dismiss, a determination that cut through the layers of formality and protocol that usually defined the space. Roberts, however, remained a stoic force. His mind worked quickly, seeking his next move, a way to reassert control over the narrative he was so used to commanding. He could feel the growing unease in the room, and it unsettled him more than he would admit. But he could not afford to show weakness. He cleared his throat and steadied himself. We are here to decide on the facts, Ms. Crockett, not to indulge in idealistic fantasies. Your calls for reform and change might be noble, but they are untethered from reality. Crockett's eyes never wavered as she leaned forward, her response swift and unrelenting. I'm not here to indulge in fantasies, Justice Roberts. I'm here to fight for a reality where everyone has an equal shot at the American dream, where the law serves justice, not the powerful. And that is a reality I intend to fight for, no matter who stands in my way. With each exchange, the tension thickened. The room felt like it was closing in, the weight of their words growing heavier, more urgent. The court was no longer just a place for the legal elite. It had become the battlefield for the soul of the nation. Cliffhanger. And then, Crockett's words pierced the air. One statement that would turn the tide in a way no one expected. The room was at a standstill, the air thick with the weight of the debate, as the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The tension between Jasmine Crockett and John Roberts was no longer just a clash of ideologies. It had become a battle of wills. Every word spoken felt like a high-stakes wager. Every glance exchanged a calculated move in the game of legal and moral authority. Crockett stood, her shoulders squared, unwavering in the face of Roberts' pointed criticisms. His voice had been unrelenting, methodical in its attack. He had tried to frame her words as naive, to categorize her ideals as impractical. He had dismissed her arguments, questioning their feasibility, their relevance. But she hadn't flinched. Each question he threw her way only sharpened her resolve, and with each exchange, the room grew more invested in the clash unfolding before them. Roberts' voice rang out again. Cutting through the silence, his words laced with frustration. "You claim that the law is broken, Ms. Crockett, that the system is inherently unjust. But the law is the foundation of our society. It is the glue that holds us together. Change must come from within the system, through reason, through careful deliberation, not through rhetoric and grand gestures. What you suggest in your idealism is a path to chaos." There it was, the challenge that Crockett had been waiting for. Her eyes never left his, the fire behind them still glowing, though her face remained calm. She had heard these criticisms before, time and time again, from those who clung to the status quo, from those who refused to acknowledge that the system was not designed for everyone. It wasn't just about winning this case. It was about winning respect for what she represented, a new wave of thinking, a new understanding of justice. The courtroom was silent, waiting for her response, each second stretching longer than the last. Crockett took a deep breath, her steadying exhale the only sound breaking the stillness. Then she spoke, softly but with the power of a woman who had fought too long to be heard. "Justice isn't something you can just fix from within, Justice Roberts. It isn't something that can be bandaged up and patched into place with more regulations, more committee meetings, and more paperwork. Justice is about equality. Equality for those who have been silenced, marginalized, and left behind by the very system you claim to uphold. What you call law and order has been a tool of oppression, not fairness. It has been a force that divides, not unites." Her voice remained calm, but the words were sharp, each one carefully crafted to pierce through the facade of indifference Roberts had carefully constructed over his decades of service. She wasn't just attacking the man before her, she was attacking an entire system that had allowed the powerful to decide who mattered and who didn't. For a moment, the room was still again, as though the air had gone out of it entirely. Crockett's words hung there, suspended in the space between her and Roberts, the weight of her statement settling over everyone in the room. The audience was stunned. Judges remained motionless, their expressions unreadable, but a flicker of something, recognition, passed through their eyes. Crockett's calm was not just confidence. It was the kind of strength born from living through the system that Roberts had always protected. And then, in a subtle shift, something happened. Roberts, the man who had made his career out of maintaining a stoic, emotionless presence, faltered. His usual stern, unwavering expression softened for a moment. His jaw, which had been tight, relaxed slightly. His gaze, once steely, calculating, shifted just a little. There was no smile, no visible sign of defeat, but something was unmistakably different. He had been hit in a place that mattered to him, his principles. For the first time in the entire exchange, Roberts didn't have an immediate rebuttal. The sharp edge of his earlier remarks had dulled, the tension in the room had shifted. He had heard her, really heard her, but what did that mean? Was he just adjusting his strategy, finding a way to reassert control, or was something else stirring beneath the surface? The question hovered in the air as the courtroom leaned in, waiting for him to respond. And yet, for a long moment, Roberts said nothing. His lips pressed together in that characteristic way, as though weighing the impact of her words. In his silence, Crockett's point had landed, and with that silence, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. But the question remained, Was this the moment Roberts would finally see the truth? Was he capable of acknowledging that the system he had so long upheld had never truly served the people it was supposed to protect? The room, caught between the tension of anticipation and the weight of Crockett's truth, waited for Roberts to respond. But it wasn't his response that would change the course of the day. It was hers. Crockett's voice, steady as ever, cut through the silence again, like a final blow. "I don't expect you to agree with me, Justice Roberts, but I don't need you to. What I need is for you to see that we cannot keep pretending that the law is blind when we've seen its hand guiding the rich and the powerful for centuries, while the rest of us are left to fight for scraps." This time, the silence in the room was not just stunned. It was reflective, and it was full of the recognition that, for once, the truth had been laid bare. No amount of legal precedent, no well-constructed argument could diminish the power of her words. The shift was palpable. It was as if a wall had been broken open, just a crack, but enough for the light to filter through. The audience sat stunned. Some were visibly moved. Some were uncomfortable with the force of her delivery. Some perhaps were shifting allegiances, torn between their respect for Roberts and the undeniable weight of Crockett's conviction. As the moments passed, it became clear that something had changed, not just in the courtroom, but in the conversation about justice in America. Crockett had not only forced Roberts to question his own beliefs, she had made the rest of the world question them, too. And with that final line, Crockett had achieved what no one had dared to do before. She had shifted the narrative, turning the tide in her favor. Now the question was no longer about whether she could win this case. It was about whether Roberts would continue to fight for the system he had spent a lifetime defending, or whether he would acknowledge that it was broken, that it needed to change. And in that pivotal moment, the world was watching. The moment Jasmine Crockett spoke those final words, the air in the courtroom hadn't just shifted, it had cracked wide open. Her words were more than just a legal argument. They were a revelation, an exposure of truths that had remained buried for far too long. And outside the four walls of the Supreme Court, the ripple effect of her response began to unfold, shaping a cultural wave that was impossible to ignore. The very second the court's proceedings paused, the digital world exploded. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram were inundated with reactions, commentary, and personal reflections. Crockett stands became a viral sensation within minutes of the moment's broadcast. The hashtag was used by millions of people across the country to voice their approval, their shock, and in some cases, their disbelief at what they had just witnessed. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone in the courtroom speak with such unfiltered passion, so unafraid to challenge the system that had always been set in its ways. On the political spectrum, the reactions were divided, but one thing was clear. Crockett's words had landed. For those who had long called for reform, for justice, and for the reevaluation of outdated systems, Crockett was a hero, the embodiment of what they had been fighting for. Celebrities, activists, and influencers from all walks of life took to their platforms, amplifying the moment. A tweet from a well-known actor read, "Finally someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth. See Crockett stands." Another post from a prominent civil rights leader said, "Jasmine Crockett just did what many have feared to do. She spoke truth to power." It's time for change. But for every voice of support, there was an equal amount of criticism. Conservative pundits and media outlets quickly rushed to frame Crockett's words as dangerous, as reckless. "This is not the place for grandstanding," one popular commentator argued. What we saw today was a calculated move for political gain, not justice. John Roberts, the target of Crockett's direct challenge, became the subject of much of this backlash. Some critics accused him of being out of touch with the realities facing marginalized communities. Others went even further, questioning his motives and accusing him of playing the moderate card while upholding policies that many believed were oppressive. But despite the backlash, public support for Crockett continued to surge. Television networks replayed her words over and over again, dissecting every syllable, every pause. Pundits on both sides of the political spectrum couldn't ignore the magnitude of what had just happened. In the days following the trial, the question was no longer about the case itself. It was about Crockett's influence, her presence, and the way she had shifted the narrative in the courtroom. One legal analyst wrote, "Jasmine Crockett has done something that no one in that room expected. She has made John Roberts look at the system with a new set of eyes. She has forced us all to reconsider the laws that we've long accepted as gospel. The legal community, particularly those who had long been advocating for reforms in the judicial system, began to ask whether Roberts, in his silence, had acknowledged the truth in Crockett's words. Some pointed to his softened expression during the exchange as evidence that he had begun to understand the broader implications of his own decisions. The narrative in the media slowly began to shift. People began to question whether Roberts had truly represented justice, or whether he had simply defended the status quo. Could he remain the face of impartiality when so many felt the system he upheld had failed so many? The conversation expanded far beyond legal circles. This was now about America's identity, its moral compass, and its willingness to change. While Crockett's critics were loud and vocal, a shift in public perception was undeniable. Social media flooded with support for her stance, with people from all walks of life coming to her defense. One teacher from Detroit tweeted, "What she said isn't just for the courtroom. It's for every classroom, every community struggling to be seen." In a way, Crockett had united those who had long felt disenfranchised with the very people who still believed in the system she was challenging. Even some in the political establishment found themselves compelled to speak up. Bernie Sanders, never one to hold back, tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just win that courtroom. She won the hearts of millions who are demanding that the law serve the people, not the powerful." On the other hand, Senator Mitch McConnell and other staunch conservatives criticized her rhetoric as dangerous and divisive, arguing that her actions in the courtroom only fueled the fires of division. But despite the backlash from the right, the momentum was with Crockett. Her words, her actions had set a new precedent, one that had moved the conversation in ways few expected. There was no denying it. She had struck a chord. The media continued to pick apart the implications of Crockett's challenge. Were her words a game changer? Had she made the Supreme Court for once truly confront the way it had been shaping the future? Or had she just opened a Pandora's box that would eventually tear the country apart? The opinion pieces poured in, each one offering a different interpretation, but all acknowledging the same thing. Crockett had made the old guard, represented by Roberts and others, face the uncomfortable truth that perhaps their time was coming to an end. Despite the fractures in public opinion, one thing became clear: Crockett had emerged victorious, not just in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion. And though there was still work to be done, still battles to fight, the victory was undeniable. The moment she had created in the courtroom had sparked something larger, a movement that would not be silenced, no matter how many voices tried to drown it out. As the days wore on, Crockett's words continued to resonate in the hearts and minds of millions across the nation. She had set something in motion that no one could stop, not the establishment, not the critics, and certainly not the status quo. And as the world continued to process what had just happened, the truth remained. Justice had a new voice, and it was ready to be heard. The aftermath of that courtroom moment had shaken America to its core, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered, reverberating across the nation. What began as a legal battle between ideologies, a clash of wills in the halls of the highest court, had transformed into something far more profound. Crockett's challenge wasn't just a critique of the law. It was a call to action, an invitation for America to confront its own flaws and to choose a path that transcended partisan division. Days had passed since the case, but the moment still felt fresh, like the first spark of a fire that continued to burn bright. Crockett stood before the cameras, the weight of the moment still settling in. Her victory was undeniable, not just in the case, but in the hearts and minds of the millions who had watched, listened, and found inspiration in her words. "I didn't come to this fight for the spotlight," Crockett began, her voice calm yet filled with conviction. "I came because I believe in the idea of a nation that stands for justice, a nation that believes everyone deserves the same chance, the same dignity, the same right to thrive. And in this moment, I realized something. Justice isn't a battle to be won. It's a principle to uphold. Her words, simple yet powerful, landed with a thud. They weren't the kind of words that demanded applause or admiration. They were the kind of words that asked the audience to reflect on their own actions, their own beliefs, and the role they played in shaping the world around them. Crockett paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking again, her eyes soft but resolute. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about me. It wasn't about winning against a man like John Roberts or making a grand statement to further my career. No, it was about standing for what is right, no matter the consequences. It was about being willing to stand alone, if necessary, in order to do what needs to be done. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the emotion behind her words. Her gaze shifted to the distance as if remembering the years of struggle, the battles fought in obscurity, the challenges that had never been televised, never documented. Her journey wasn't the story of a politician making headlines. It was the story of a woman who had been fighting for change long before the world had started paying attention. America was built on a foundation of ideals, freedom, equality, and justice for all. But for so many, those ideals are still a dream, not a reality, Crockett continued. And every day we are presented with a choice, to either uphold those ideals or to let them slip away into history, forgotten and ignored. The choice is ours. We can stay comfortable in the system we've inherited, or we can take a stand and push for something better. She looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to the lawmakers, not just to her colleagues in the room, but to every citizen watching at home. Empathy is the foundation of true leadership, she said, her voice unwavering. It's not about winning at all costs or protecting the status quo. It's about caring for those who are vulnerable, who are silenced, and who are left behind by the system. It's about seeing others not as obstacles or threats, but as people who are worthy of the same rights, the same opportunities. That's the kind of leadership we need. She paused again, her hands clasped in front of her. We've seen the system fail far too many. We've seen it fail when it comes to healthcare, education, and housing. We've seen it fail when it comes to race, class, and gender. The question we all need to ask ourselves is, what are we willing to do to fix it? How far are we willing to go? Crockett's gaze hardened slightly, but her tone remained measured, thoughtful. This isn't about popularity. It's not about getting likes or gaining followers. It's about doing what is right, even when it isn't easy, even when it's not what everyone wants to hear. Because justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with applause. It often comes with resistance, with obstacles, and yes, with those who want to keep things the way they are. But if we're going to have a better future, we have to fight for it. Every single day, her voice softened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the weight of everything she had said, and everything that had come before, settled into her expression. When I stood in that courtroom, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for all of us, and I will continue to fight for justice, for the underdog, for the voiceless, and for the forgotten. Because that's what this country is supposed to be about. And if we want it to be better, we all have to step up and take part in the fight. The room fell silent, as if absorbing the gravity of her words. But in the silence, there was also a sense of determination. Crockett wasn't just a voice in the crowd anymore. She had become a symbol of change, someone who had taken a stand in the face of overwhelming resistance, someone who had redefined what it meant to fight for justice. She finished, her words hanging in the air like the final notes of a song. We can't afford to wait for someone else to make the changes we need. We are the change we seek. It's time to take a stand. And that means all of us, because justice doesn't work unless we all work for it. Her speech, though simple in its message, had ignited a fire. It had reminded the country of what it truly meant to fight. Not for power, not for accolades, but for something far more enduring. Principle. The camera pulled back slowly, capturing Crockett standing tall, her eyes steady and focused. The emotional crescendo had built to this moment, and as the screen faded to black, the message was clear. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice, equality, and dignity would continue, as long as there were people like Jasmine Crockett willing to take a stand, to speak truth, and to inspire others to do the same. It was a message that resonated, and one that would continue to echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. Because in the end, the loudest statements are often made in silence, and the courage to stand is what defines a true victory. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a legal exchange, it was a defining moment for America. Jasmine Crockett's response didn't just capture the attention of the nation, it shifted the narrative. It reminded us all of the power of truth in the face of oppression, the strength of courage when standing alone, and the undeniable weight of integrity when it challenges the system. In that brief, unguarded moment, Crockett redefined what it means to fight for justice in a broken world, and in doing so, she became a symbol for the many voices that have been ignored for far too long. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a victory for the people, for those who believe in a future built on fairness, empathy, and accountability. The world saw that even in the most powerful institutions, change is possible when someone dares to speak out and stand up. Crockett didn't just challenge a legal precedent. She challenged a system that has long excluded the voices of the marginalized and oppressed. Now, it's up to us to keep that momentum alive. If this moment inspired you, share this video. Let's make sure the world remembers what happens when one person stands for truth. Share Crockett's message of courage, of justice, and of the belief that we all have the power to change the world, no matter how difficult the fight. Because sometimes, the loudest statements aren't made in speeches. They're made in silence and in the courage to stand. Let's stand together and remind the world that truth, justice, and integrity are worth fighting for. Thank you for watching.